This module provides an overview of the R2 equipment categorization document, which is referred to as the REC. While the intention of this training module is to increase understanding of the REC, it is not intended to be used as a standalone guide. The official text of the REC can be downloaded from the CERI website. The REC is a companion document to R2v3 and was designed to provide more consistency throughout the reuse recycling chain by providing standardized categories to describe the condition and status of electronic equipment, components, and materials throughout sorting, evaluation, and processing. Although the REC is strictly a reference document and does not contain any auditable requirements, use of the REC is necessary to implement many of the requirements in the standard. While use of the REC categories is preferred, it's permissible for facilities to use their own internal categories if they are mapped to equivalent REC categories. The standardized categories in the REC will provide more consistency across the industry and make it easier for facilities, as well as DSVs and customers, to accurately communicate the status of electronic equipment, components, and materials. REC categories can also be used by non-R2 recyclers to enhance the consistency of identification throughout the reuse recycling chain. An important benefit of more standardized and consistent categorization is that it will allow facilities to recognize the processes already completed by other facilities, eliminating the need to repeat work that has already been done. For example, if a facility purchases used hard drives that have been sanitized by another R2 facility, there is no need to repeat that process. The REC also helps with audit preparedness by defining the processing paths or next steps so that facilities can ensure all applicable R2 requirements are met for the equipment, components, and materials they are managing. The REC has two different sections: processing categories that help identify the current processing status of electronic equipment, components, and materials, as well as the next R2 processing steps, and functioning product categories that describe the cosmetic condition and level of functionality of equipment and components. Let's take a closer look at processing categories. When a facility receives incoming equipment, components, and materials, it must determine the processing status of incoming items. To do so, it must evaluate two things. The first is R2 applicability. Are the incoming products and materials an R2 controlled stream that needs to be managed according to R2 processing requirements, the appendices, and controls? In other words, do R2 processing controls apply to the incoming products or materials? Or is the incoming stream an unrestricted stream outside the scope of R2 processing requirements? Based on this determination, all items or materials must be categorized as either an R2 controlled stream or an unrestricted stream. The second processing category that must be determined is data sanitization status. Equipment and components must be categorized as either pre-sanitization or non-data. The default assumption for all incoming equipment, components, and materials is that items are an R2 controlled stream and pre-sanitized until proven otherwise. It's the responsibility of the R2 facility to determine the actual status through the sorting and categorization process. Table 1 in the REC defines the different types of R2 controlled streams. The examples listed in the table are not individual categories unto themselves. They're only included to provide more clarity about the types of items that are categorized as R2 controlled streams. R2 controlled streams fall within the scope of equipment or materials covered in Core Requirement 1 of the R2 standard, and require further R2 evaluation and processing in accordance with the applicable R2 process requirements. Table 1 also lists the next R2 processing steps for various R2 controlled streams. Because not all R2 facilities are qualified or equipped to process every type of equipment or materials, the REC specifies next steps for both in-house processing as well as next steps for processing by a downstream vendor. For example, a recycling facility that receives a shipment of potentially reusable laptops has several processing options. Sanitize and test and repair in-house if they are certified to Appendix B, data sanitization, and Appendix C, test and repair requirements, or they can send the laptops to a downstream vendor who has the expertise to data sanitize and test and repair, and has been qualified by the R2 facility to the requirements of Appendix A, downstream recycling chain. Table 1 also gives examples of unrestricted streams that do not require further R2 processing or downstream verification. Here are a few types of unrestricted streams listed in Table 1 of the rec. New equipment or components in unopened original packaging. Notice in the right column is the next R2 processing step. In this case, it is not R2 applicable because new unopened products are outside the scope of R2, which pertains to used electronics. The next example is non-electronic equipment. In the R2 standard, electronic equipment refers to equipment that is primarily information or communications technology, such as computers, phones, copiers, and TVs. Non-electronic equipment in the R2 standard includes items such as appliances, which may contain electronic components, but do not meet the R2 definition of an electronic device. But notice that even though non-electronic equipment doesn't require R2 controls, it must still be managed under the Core 2 hierarchy requirements. That means that items that can be reused or recycled should be. Disposal is not permitted unless no other viable reuse or recycling options exist. R2 facilities must demonstrate to an auditor that they've exhausted all reuse or recycling options before disposing of material in the most environmentally beneficial way. Non-focus materials are also listed as an example of an unrestricted stream, but must also be managed according to the Core 2 hierarchy requirements. For example, the metal or plastic housing of a computer is not a focus material, but would need to be recycled according to the Core 2 hierarchy requirements. The last example on this list is planned returns, which refers to a very specific and rare situation, which we will examine next. Planned returns are intended to be used for occasional limited exceptions to standard operating processes, but not as a regular ongoing practice for handling equipment or components that contain focus materials. If it is a frequent practice to buy equipment or components and then return failed items, then downstream vendor due diligence is required on the supplier to which the failed equipment is returned. Planned returns include warranty returns, where a failed component is returned to the manufacturer under warranty for a replacement to repair equipment for reuse. Recalls, where equipment or components are returned to the manufacturer under a recall. Return to individual owner refers to personal equipment that is returned to the individual owner after a failed service attempt. Failed equipment refers to the return of failed equipment or components that were purchased as tested and working equipment. Errant shipment refers to equipment or components received in error and returned to the sender. Damaged in shipment refers to reusable equipment or components that are damaged and are rejected and returned. Non-conforming equipment refers to delivered equipment that does not meet the purchase specifications and is rejected and returned. Any planned returns must be documented to clearly demonstrate to an auditor that the return meets the criteria in the rec. So that was R2 applicability. The other processing category that must be determined is data sanitization status. Table 2 of the rec provides types of equipment and the associated data sanitization status categories. As a reminder, the first and default category for equipment is always pre-sanitization. This includes any data devices that have not yet been evaluated for data sanitization status, as well as items that have been evaluated and are determined to require data sanitization. All pre-sanitization devices must be adequately secured and directed to an applicable R2 data sanitization process. The other data sanitization category is non-data. This only applies to devices that have been sanitized or are confirmed to be free of any data so that they can be categorized and handled as non-data. The rec lists some types of equipment for this category. First on the list is non-data devices such as a monitor, keyboard, or other item without storage. Another is evaluated as not containing data, such as computers without hard drives, or devices with accompanying documentation from an R2 supplier that verifies sanitization has been performed. Non-data also includes items that have been sanitized through physical destruction of data or logical sanitization using software. After equipment has been sanitized, tested, and verified as functioning, it moves from the R2 applicability categories to the functioning product categories. So now let's move from the two processing categories to the two functioning product categories. The two functioning product categories that facilities must evaluate are functioning product categories used to identify the level of functionality of the devices or components, and cosmetic categories used to identify the cosmetic and physical appearance. These functioning product categories are for equipment or components that will be directed to reuse. They do not apply to end-of-life equipment that's destined for materials recovery. So first, let's examine the categories that define the level of functionality. All equipment and components that have been tested and confirmed functioning and are data sanitized need to be assigned a functioning product category. This is to identify both the level of functionality of the item as well as any defects or missing parts or components. Table 4 of the REC provides 6 different functioning product categories. F1 is for products that are identified as collectible or specialty equipment under Core Requirement 6. This category allows collectible or specialty products to be sold without testing or qualifying the buyer, as long as specialty sales do not exceed 1% of the total units sold in a rolling 12-month average. This is intended for R2 facilities that only process a small amount of collectible or specialty equipment. F2 is for verified specialty electronics that have gone through the verification process in Appendix D, Specialty Electronics. And categories F3 through F6 are for equipment and components that have been tested and confirmed to be functioning in accordance with Appendix C, Test and Repair. There are detailed descriptions for each category to help facilities determine the appropriate category to assign to equipment or components. This snapshot of Table 4 shows the level of detail for each of the product functionality descriptions. Each category has specific criteria that must be assessed to determine whether an item meets that level of functionality. In addition to these functionality descriptions, there are also cosmetic descriptions that must be assigned. There are a range of cosmetic descriptions to communicate the condition and physical appearance of equipment and components that are destined for reuse. It's very important to note, however, that cosmetic descriptions and categories cannot be used in any way to determine or communicate the functionality or data sanitization status of equipment or components. Table 3 from the REC provides a range of cosmetic categories, along with detailed descriptions that can be used to identify the cosmetic condition of reusable equipment. While use of REC categories are preferred, R2 facilities can use equivalent categories that are mapped to the REC or provide a detailed description of the cosmetic condition that characterizes the physical appearance and any damage or missing parts. A couple of points of clarification on this list. The C0 or not categorized description refers to items that have been tested and verified functional but have not yet received a cosmetic assessment and grading. C1, or damaged category, applies to items that, although tested and functioning, are not deemed to be suitable for reuse due to the extensive level of damage to the device and are instead directed to materials recovery. To get a better idea of the level of detail included in the items on the list, here are a few other cosmetic descriptions. The C4, used good category, identifies 4 different things a facility must evaluate to determine if equipment or components fit this description: surface scratches and imperfections, signs of wear and labeling, small dents or discolorations where tags or labels had been, and any damage to latches or hinges or missing parts, panels, bezels, or covers. The C7 certified pre-owned category, which is for items that have been refurbished by the seller or manufacturer, covers items that are in much better physical condition, fully restored to like-new condition, fully cleaned, with no blemishes or missing parts. And the C8 unused category applies to items that are new and unused but have been removed from original packaging and have no signs of wear or alteration. A few key takeaways from the REC. The REC helps to identify applicable R2 requirements and the workflow for all equipment, components, and materials at all stages throughout processing. The REC also provides consistency in descriptions and categorizations, and allows facilities to accept the REC categorizations of other facilities. And finally, a reminder that specific REC terminology does not need to be used if a facility maps and documents their internal categories to the corresponding REC categories. To learn more about the REC, or Core Requirement 6, for sorting, categorization, and processing, visit the R2 Knowledge Base on the SARI website.